Welcome to the Suspension Sessions from RBC, the podcast that dives into the science, service and setup behind MTB suspension. I'm Glenn, and together Robbie and I explore the fundamentals every rider should understand, from sag and seals to tuning, service intervals and long-term performance. If you want your suspension dialed, you're in the right place. Let's get into it. Here we are with another episode in the Suspension Sessions. Today we're stepping back a bit and looking at one of the biggest suspension choices riders face: air versus coil. With me is Robbie Powell from RBC, and let's get into it, Robbie.
How's it, Glenn? Firstly, happy Christmas to everybody, to all our listeners out there. Hope you're having a fantastic festive season and spending some time riding your bike. And after listening today, I think it's going to give you some food for thought, because this is quite a bit of debate in regards to what to choose when you're choosing suspension.
Well, let's start with air, the one they call the versatile all-rounder.
Well, air suspension, actually comes on most bikes. And I think probably 99.9% of all full suspension and hardtail bikes sold these days have an air shock or an air rear shock or an air fork. And the obvious reason for that is that the manufacturer doesn't know who's going to be riding the bike. So from an ease of setup and provision of the bike to the consumer at the end, the air shock is much more convenient because you pump it to your weight and off you go. So where a coil is a lot more specific. It's difficult to match a coil with a weight unless you're there, and it's also more specific to your riding style and also to the type of bike. So hence you find a lot more air shocks on bikes.
So to dial in some air suspension, it's quite easy. You just need a shock pump.
It's very easy. You pump it up, you set up your sag, and off you go. Okay. So it's easy for a salesman on the floor to sell a bike.
And tokens as well you can have?
Tokens, it's a different conversation to have because it's more of a tuning thing. But tokens are definitely a feature. Most forks or rear shocks will come, if the air will come with some form of token in. And normally on the rear shocks, the manufacturer, when they look at the kinematics of the suspension system on the bike, will set up the shock with some or other form of token, if necessary, to bring it in line with what they want to achieve out of the suspension stroke.
And then the other advantage of air is that your package is a little bit lighter.
Well, yes, I think at a time when mountain bikes are actually getting heavier, as the amount of travel increases and as the form of riding we're doing changes, so the bikes are starting to get a little bit heavier. So I think the difference of the 200-300 grams between coil and air in a trail or an enduro setup is actually redundant now, almost. I think from a cross-country perspective, I would have to say that air will always be the choice because of the compression feel or the firmness that it will give you. But from a trail and enduro or just normal fun riding perspective, I think the coil, the 300 grams, 200 grams difference in weight is not going to make a big difference to the rider.
Well, let's talk about the benefits of coil suspension. Why would one go for coil?
Okay, let's just talk about air first, I think, before we get into that. So air is a fantastic package, as we've discussed. There are some downsides of air, especially if you're doing longer downhill style or enduro riding. You definitely change in altitude is going to have a change in air pressure in your shock. If you start at sea level and you climb to 1,000 meters, your shock is going to feel stiffer. If you set it at the sea level and you go up to 1,000, 1,500 meters, it's definitely going to have a difference in feel. On the way down, your shock is going to heat up, as we discussed it. A normal shock runs at 120 degrees Celsius. On a long downhill like an enduro, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, that shock's going to get closer to 200, 300 degrees inside. Obviously, the air that's flowing around it is helping it cool it, but it's increasing in volume because of the heat that's coming into it. So two things will happen. Your oil viscosity is going to change. Let's say you had a 5-weight oil at the top of the hill. When you hit 100 degrees, your oil viscosity is definitely going to change. As the temperature increases, so the oil viscosity is going to get thinner, and your air pressure is going to get harder because of the amount of heat that's going into the system. So your shock is definitely going to change characteristics from the top to the bottom. And in layman's terms, you're probably not going to see a difference for a guy who's doing trail riding, and that he's probably not going to feel the difference. But for a professional rider who's doing enduro and wants the best out of it, there will be a noticeable impact to how the suspension feels from the top to the bottom. Where coil, on the other hand, doesn't have those issues. You've only got the damper. The coil shock is handling all up in and out movement. It's taking all the heat itself and dissipating it through the coil spring. So you're not getting any of that build-up that you would do if you had a nice air blanket wrapped around it. So obviously there is still heat going into the system because there is a heat exchange happening with the energy going into the damper. So that will obviously have an effect, but it's not going to have as a marked effect as it would be if it was an air shock. So I think from that perspective, there's again, it's kind of like, okay, where do you draw the line between air and coil? And I think that for me is where I would draw the line, because you will have a difference in feel and it will be noticeable.
So it's not just a linear versus a more progressive response for the air. It goes deeper than that.
Yeah, a lot deeper than that. Yeah.
Okay, so small bump sensitivity?
The major difference I think that people don't understand between air and coil is that air, you have a number of seals that are holding the air in place. And those seals are gripping the stanchions of the shock or the oil body quite hard to hold that pressure inside. And that causes stiction. So that's friction between the seal and the stanchion. So before the shock can move, you've actually got to overcome that. Although the shock manufacturers are trying to reduce that by increasing the size of the negative chamber, it's a case of, well, how far do you want to go with the negative chamber before you just decide to go to coil anyway? In my opinion, the difference between air and coil is so great. Even if you make it more linear, the coil is still going to feel better than the air. So your initial bump force is going to be transmitted through the bike in the form of that stiction, where the coil it's pretty much seamless. So you're not having that high friction that you would have with the air shock. However, there is a consideration to take into it when coil shock is not for everything. You need to decide if your bike is going to work with that or not. So that's a different story, but we'll come to that.
And that's where they talk about the plushness of the
Yes,
of the
100%.
coil.
Yeah. Well, there's no stiction in coil. There's a small amount of friction, which you will see if you had to do a spring dyno on a coil shock. The initial movement of the damper will create some initial stiction, but it's very small compared to an air spring.
Are we going to talk about reliability and servicing?
Yeah, I think it's a valid point. If you look at the shock manufacturers, on the rear shock, they will take the same damper that they use for the air and they put a coil over it. So essentially you're buying the same thing, although one is wrapped in air and the other one's got a coil spring. The difference between the two is the heat that's going to be now generated in the air spring versus the cooling or the less heat effectiveness in the coil. So in my experience, I find that coil shocks have a longer service life than the air shocks, just because of that heat generation.
So your oil doesn't degrade as fast, your seals last longer.
Once you put so much heat into it, you do get soot forming, your oil splits, and obviously then you don't have any damping. So that definitely happens a lot faster in an air shock, in our experience. I'd like to just add that when we're talking about suspension, air is the suspension medium and the coil is the suspension medium. The dampers in both of the situations are only the heat exchange, where the forces are damped, basically the input force and the output force. And that or exchange also creates heat. So when we're talking about a shock, the suspension is actually the medium. So it's either the air or it's the coil.
So you were talking about positive and negative chamber.
Yeah.
That is on an air spring.
That's on an air shock, air fork. And typically the air spring, the positive is much bigger than the negative. It's quite a calculation that the guys use when they decide on how to manufacture that. So when the engineer is drawing up the suspension, he looks at who's going to be riding the bike. So a rider's 80, 90 kilograms, between 70 to 90 kilograms. That rider is where you're going to see the most sales happening. So they try and make that suspension to fit that specific target. Once you fall out of that, so either lower than that, so under 50 kilograms, or over than that, over 100 kilograms, we need to look at a different way of tuning that suspension, because that negative spring is not applying enough force or applying too little force to the positive side. So a lot of the guys will make some changes to that by trying to increase the size of the negative chamber, which puts more pressure on the positive chamber, which means that your positive air pressure has to be higher. So there's a lot of negative side effects. You'll see in the cross-country shocks, normally only up to 300 psi, where in the enduro shocks, up to 360 psi, because the negative chamber is much bigger. And consequently, to hold the same weight of rider, they need a bigger positive chamber to combat the negative.
And that's also in an effort to make it more linear, like a coil.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So from a maintenance perspective, I think that, as I said before, the heat definitely has an effect on the air shock. Obviously, both damper units will be affected by the heat, but the one is going to be a lot more prolonged. And so we found that the coil shocks, obviously, they do require maintenance, but the service time is a little bit longer.
So the set and forget mentality regarding coils is not really valid. You still have to have them serviced.
Oh, of course. Yeah. No, everything needs to be serviced. I mean, you can't ride your drivetrain without changing your chain or ride your tires forever. It's a big work. In fact, it's the most hardest working part of your bike. So consequently, it needs to be serviced. Just because it's closed, a lot of people think it doesn't do anything, but actually it's working really hard.
Coil is obviously not for everybody. How would you decide between, okay, I've heard the positives and the negatives. How now would you decide whether coil is for you or air is for you?
Well, I think that anyone who rides a trail or an enduro or an e-bike that's longer travel should be riding coil. I think that the ride quality and the feel and just the whole stability of the bike, having a matching coil in the front and back is going to make a big difference on the ride quality of the bike. And actually, suspension will make a great bike fantastic. So putting the right suspension on a bike is going to change the way the bike rides for the better. And everyone wants that in the end.
And are there any limitations to your frame type that would limit you whether you could use the one or the other?
Yeah, I think when you're looking at smaller cross-country style frames, there's limited amount of space that you can squeeze a coil into. Also, obviously the shorter travel bikes, not really designed for a coil. And also the kinematics, when the product manager designing the bike or the engineers designing the bike, they're setting up the kinematics for the type of riding that they want the bike to work best at. And so you can actually have a linkage setup that is not conducive to coil. So there's too much progression in it, which means it's going to blow through its travel.
That's a big word, kinematics. What does it mean?
Well, it's actually very simple the way the suspension works. So the curve that the suspension creates, the linkage creates when it's compressing. So everything works on a leverage ratio. So the lever, as it goes through its travel, how and when it's at its longest and when it's at the shortest, when it's exerting the most power or when it's exerting the least power, all has a different effect on how the suspension is compressed.
So basically what you're saying is that could lead to overstressing of the suspension frame.
No, just the bike won't ride properly. So it'll wallow around, or it won't be firm enough, or you're going to have to find some weird spring that'll have to work for you. So the spring will have to be too hard, or it's not going to feel great.
You'll just never have an optimized ride.
No. So there are bikes out there with falling rate linkages, older models with a falling rate linkage that will never work with the coil, where they need an air spring progressive compression to actually work properly. But you'll understand that when you start searching Google, and AI will come up with a solution for you with regards to that. Or speak to us.
Good luck on the AI.
Forks.
Yep. Okay.
Don't forget about forks. The most important part of the bike is, the fork doesn't have any kinematics. The rear suspension has got all the kinematics. The fork just works straight up and down. So a lot of guys will put a coil on the back and not put one on the front, but actually it works just as good on the front. So a few of the manufacturers don't come out with a coil option. If they do put an aftermarket coil in, it will scratch the air shafts or the insides of the air chambers on the stanchions, which means that they can never go back to air again. But some of the manufacturers, one of them being Olin's, they have an air cartridge. So you can actually just swap cartridges with the air cartridge with the coil cartridge at will. And you can have the best of both worlds. So you can have one day, and the next you take it out and put the coil cartridge in, and you've got your fork as a coil fork. And if you wanted to go back to air, just a matter of taking out the coil, putting the air cartridge in. Öhlins have a air spring, an additional air spring that they built into the bottom of the damper side of the fork. And as the coil spring compresses, so that air will ramp up in the bottom of the fork leg, it sits there naturally, and that will create some progressiveness at the end of the stroke, just to firm that last section of travel up. You're obviously going to have a lot more control. Your traction is going to be a much more increased, because you're not going to have the fork bumping all over the place. The wheel is going to stay on the ground, and the bike is going to track a lot better. I find that the coil on the front does help a lot with traction, because it's a little bit heavier, so it does keep the wheel more glued to the ground, especially over high-speed stutters and stuff like that. It tends to want to track much better than an air shock, which does sometimes suffer from a little bit of stiction.
So that's where the planted feeling comes
exactly.
from. Other manufacturers, do they have any sort of fancy ways of trying to make things work?
There's lots of ways to make a coil work. So there's a couple of aftermarket suppliers, air-sprung being one of them. They make a really nice coil system that you can fit into most suspension forks, that has an oil-dampened kind of bottom-out feature, which is really cool. So that's something that you would be able to fit into your standard Fox or Rock Shocks or whatever they have available on their platform. And on the rear shocks, there's some interesting designs out there with, again, also bottom-out features where your progressiveness at the end of the stroke is instead of using the bumper to create progressiveness in the last couple of centimeters of the travel, they use an oil dampen system where you can adjust the amount of oil flowing through the orifice in that last couple of centimeters of stroke to basically change how that feels.
And in terms of a rear shock and lockout, or a fork and lockout, is there a difference between the two?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you were riding with coil, lockout wouldn't be an option. It's not something that you would have, probably a pedal platform. But I think that the bike that you're riding, if you're riding with coil, that's not something that you would be considering using.
So then your type of riding does not suit a coil setup if you're doing a lot of climbing?
No, I disagree. I mean, if you're doing enduro, you're going to be climbing a lot. And that's where the pedal platform comes in. Pedal platform will firm up the compression side of the damper, allowing you to pedal a lot more firmly on it, give you a lot more support. You'll be able to stand up and pedal, but you'll still have some traction on the back wheel and the front fork. Where if you, unlike a cross-country bike where it's completely locked out, it's not going to feel the same.
Which then brings us up to the cost of the system. So like air versus coil for a rear shock?
It's difficult to pin it because there's some very high-end coil shocks and there's also some very high-end air shocks. So I think the most important thing that I can say is whatever budget you have, add 10% to that and look at the best possible coil that you can buy. Something that's going to really give you the best out of it. I would suggest that you look for something that's got high speed and low speed compression setup. Obviously, you want a rebound and something with obviously a piggyback. I think it's essential to have a piggyback. So the piggyback is essentially an extra oil chamber, which allows for a bigger volume of oil. And normally you've either got a floating piston inside there or a bladder that separates the oil from the nitrogen. And both of those options are going to give you a much better feel on the coil. And you're also going to resolve the heating issues.
Okay, Öhlins released a bladder upgrade for their piston setup.
Yes, that was for their TTX Air. So they went from the TTX Air M1 to the M2, the M2 being the model number 2. And the big difference between the 2 and the 1 is that the 1 still has the floating piston, which is under pressure. And obviously, as we discussed earlier on, having a seal that's under pressure creates some stiction. So by eliminating that and replacing it with a bladder, which can be compressed from any side, you will reduce that amount of stiction and make the shock feel a little bit more linear. Yeah.
And you made a video on that.
Yes, we did. A very cool video. And it actually works too. It's not just a gimmick.
Not a marketing thing.
No, 100% not.
So your coil setup is going to be a little bit more expensive, is what you're saying?
Not necessarily. Yeah?
Okay.
No. In the long run, it could end up being cheaper.
Shall we talk about some myths?
Yes. Let's talk about the stories.
Okay, myth busting the spring.
Yeah.
Coil is always better for downhill.
No, I disagree. As I mentioned earlier, I think that a downhill enduro style 5 to 10 minute downhill is more suited to a coil than an air shock, where your downhill races are actually a lot shorter. Your bikes should be a little bit lighter because you've got to accelerate them out of the corners quicker and that. So I think if you look at some of the World Cup races, they're actually using air shocks rather than coil. And that's for the very good reason that you can put a lot more compression into it, a lot firmer. And those guys are obviously at a different level, but it depends on where you are wanting to ride.
Yeah, that was another thing we didn't really speak about on the air side is the pop feel of air.
Yeah, I think that's with the bigger negative chambers that the guys are going to, with the air side feeling a lot more linear, coil-like, kind of moving away from that direction. I think that, and the newer coil shocks also you can actually tune them to have that pop feel too. So it's not a case of, well, in the old days it used to feel like this, so nowadays must feel like that as well. So no, not 100% not.
We spoke about maintenance, but there was the myth that coil shocks are maintenance free.
100% not. You still need to service them.
Air shocks are harsh compared to coil?
Yes, definitely, and no. So in a real life riding term, you will have a little bit of stiction in the air where the coil is not going to suffer from that, but harsh, no.
And then they said you can put a coil on any bike, but we've spoken about that already.
Well, I think if you're riding an e-bike, a heavier e-bike, coil is going to make a huge difference. Because the wheels are on the ground most of the time, the bike is heavier, you want that to track properly. So definitely fitting a coil on an e-bike is going to make a big difference to the ride quality of the bike. If you're looking for a trail bike and weight is a consideration, then air would be something that I would be focused on. But again, as I'm saying, it's basically, it comes down to a choice of, a lot of guys will be happy with what they have unless they've tried something else, which is why we also offer that test platform. At some of the stage races, the guys can actually test ride our forks with the coil and the air, and having tried that back to back, it always gives you a good idea of what is going to suit you better.
So you fit that on the customer's bike?
Yeah. So we'll test. We'll let the guys test that option out, so they can take either the coil or the air and come back, and we'll put because it's a cartridge, we just swap it out into the fork. And they can test it back to back on the same trail, and it's always a good way to make an educated decision.
In what I've read before, they say that ultimately there is no wrong choice, but clearly you prefer the coil.
I think without the education, without trying it, people don't know which is going to suit them better. But to get into what you're saying, I don't prefer coil over everything, but for my e-bike, I'll definitely always opt for a coil. If I'm riding a normal bike, I would probably go for air.
You need to find the choice that fits your local trails, your personal style, and obviously your bicycle.
Yeah.
So try them out and see what works for you and what feels good.
It's what I suggest is that the guys give it a try, give it a proper go, and they'll be surprised, I think, at the options out there and the choices and the ride quality that the coil will give you on a long travel bike.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Robbie. Thanks for your time and your insight into all of this stuff. I'm sure it makes it clearer for a lot of people and gives people the right information to go out and make educated choices.
I'm going to be smashing some trails tomorrow at Ken Brogy, the MTO trails in Plet, and some of my customers have just set up with coils, so I'll be joining them there tomorrow. And as far as I'm aware, it's miles for smiles for those guys.
Cool. Well, I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Have a great ride.
Thanks, man. Take care.